You thought that story was wild. Wait till you hear this story. Okay, I'm Bill Simpich, and I'm going to offer you the biography of Dallas reporter Thayer Waldo, a story that has never been told properly. I think you're going to enjoy it and really be thinking hard after you hear it. Um, Thayer Waldo wrote for the Dallas Morning, or rather the Fort Worth Star Telegram, and he claims to have been the last individual to shake hands with President Kennedy at Love Field before his car drove off. And Mr. Waldo is reported in this police report I've got here of being at the train mart waiting for the motorcade to arrive. Quote, Mr. Waldo accompanied the captain to the police car. Mr. Waldo stated to me that he heard the first bulletin which came over the Dallas police radio. And it was bulletin. The president has been shot. It is feared that others in his party have been wounded. The shots came from a triple overpass in front of the presidential automobile. And for those of you who are geographers, that's also the same direction as the grassy knoll. The sixth floor of the book depository, conversely, is behind the automobile. If you take a look at the dispatch says just that. You hear Jesse Curry saying, go to the hospital, Parkland Hospital, have them stand by, get a man up on top of the triple underpass and see what happened up there. Then you turn to the newspaper the following day, and unlike all the other stories, what you see is Mr. Waldo's article saying, security question remains puzzler. Behind the tangled web of tragic circumstance surrounding the assassination, one unanswered question. How could it have been permitted to happen? Nobody else is asking that question. Nobody. Now, Mr. Waldo had a very interesting background. His wife in the late 1930s was a woman named Grace Clements. She was not only head of what's known as the Surrealist painters movement, she was an artist, but she was also a member of the local communist movement in the Oakland area. So he saw the communist movement, if you will, firsthand. And he also, it kind of like Mr. Oswald, Mr. Waldo had an interesting background because his father was a business manager of the Stars and Stripes. He was a captain of infantry during the previous war, World War I. And the Stars and Stripes, of course, is the daily newspaper of the United States Armed Forces. He was a president and editor of McClure Newspaper Syndicate. He was well connected, very tied to the military. And Mr. Waldo is very familiar with the communists. Now, he went to South America after World War II. And here's from the FBI reports. Thayer Waldo reported a stringer for Drew Pearson. Remember Drew Pearson, famous journalist for the Washington Post, had the racier stories, more liberal type stories. In Uruguay, 1948, where he known for inaccurately reporting embassy events. He allegedly friendly with a group of Spanish communists in Uruguay. Report from Uruguay also disclosed that Waldo made derogatory remarks regarding U.S. policy in Latin America and expressed himself as sympathizer in Soviet politics. Then it goes on. Waldo also reportedly served as correspondent to Pearson in Ecuador and Colombia. After being invited to Ecuador by President Galo Plaza, subject took steps in 1950 to renounce U.S. citizenship, like Oswald. Sound familiar? And obtain Ecuadorian citizenship in order to advance official position with latter government. Later decided retain U.S. citizenship, again, just like Oswald. In 1953, was administrator of El Sol, leftist daily in Quito, that's Ecuador. Then he launched the Pacific Post newspaper later that year with a man named Francis Sutherland. That lasted for a small time only until the two men had a falling out. The feeling was aggravated when Sutherland charged that Waldo had raped his wife. After the breaking of the partnership, Mrs. Sutherland is reported to have stated that Waldo carried with him his CP membership card and that he had tried to convert her to communism. All this business about the Sutherlands, I question how much of this is true, whether it is true. So much of this, I think Waldo and maybe working with Mr. and Mrs. Sutherland, it's very, I think all this deserves a lot more investigation to find out why he's getting painted with this broad brush. In June 53, Waldo deported from Ecuador by the new president. They changed presidents quite a bit for writing derogatory articles concerning the Ecuadorian government. So first he's invited, then he's kicked out. He's deported from Uruguay, and we're going to see more deportations in his history to come. January 60, Havana Station reported Waldo as American newsman from Mexico City in Havana, who might be offered editorship of English language Times in Havana. So and then late January 60, Mexico Station reported subject discussed 6-week tour of Cuba with embassy officials. And then the files show he resided in Mexico City for 2 years prior to late 1960. So there's that piece of the story, but then here's an FBI or CIA story. This is 1960. Waldo is identified as an overt contact of the Office for Naval Intelligence, and he was living in New York City with the BCIU, First Avenue, New York City. The BCIU has lots of guests, like the ambassador, George Allen, like the director of the USIA, U.S. Information Agency, intelligence oriented, and the executive editor of the Washington Post. What's the BCIU? It is the Business Council of the International Americas, and he's their media consultant. He's tape recording dozens of interviews with dozens of individuals for Spanish language radio programs where the council will broadcast for medium wave outlets in that area, and the English version is going to be used by the Voice of America. So you can tell this guy is somehow working both sides of the street. Here's a San Francisco Chronicle article saying this reporter, Waldo reporting to himself, about himself, spent the first half of 1960 in Cuba. At that time, with the U.S. Embassy still in operation, fully staffed, 8 of its personnel were CIA agents, 3 worked for the FBI. Each of the armed services had from 1 to 5 operatives designed to intelligence work. No special effort was required to learn these facts or to identify the individuals so engaged. Within 30 days of arrival in Havana, their names and agency affiliations were made known to me without solicitation by other correspondents or embassy employees. The latter included one CIA man who volunteered the identities of all 3 persons accredited to the FBI and a Cuban receptionist, outspokenly pro-Castro, who ticked off the names of 3 CIA agents with entire accuracy, a later check confirmed. In addition to embassy staffers, the CIA had a number of operatives. I knew 14, but am satisfied there were more among the large colony of resident U.S. businessmen. He is giving away the company store in the newspaper. In the newspaper, this is highly treacherous material that's not supposed to be out there. So this is really, really bizarre for him to be putting this in the paper. If he's putting this in the paper, he's doing it on purpose at the directions of people in intelligence. Otherwise, they literally wouldn't be doing it. From July 1963 to October 1964, Waldo is serving as the feature editor of the Morning Star Telegram in Fort Worth, Texas. And furthermore, I think it's worth mentioning here that in 1956, while working for the El Paso Herald Post, he became acquainted with a man named John Sutton, who was then a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in Fort Bliss, Texas, assigned to special communications. He did not see Sutton again until Waldo, having spent about a year and a half in the Dominican Republic on a BCIU project and as correspondent for a number of U.S. papers, accepted that job of feature editor for the Fort Worth Morning Star Telegram. Again, that's the middle of 1963. So he's got this working relationship with Sutton, which is going to come up soon here. Now, Waldo, not only does he shake hands with JFK, it claims to be the last guy, but he went directly to from the trademark to the police headquarters and the afternoon of November 22nd, within 30 minutes after learning the president was shot. When I arrived at Dallas Police Headquarters, I was the first reporter in any medium, so far as I know. Certainly there was no other in evidence to reach the third floor of headquarters. No one attempted to stop me or ask for any identification at that time. So, but he's had quite a day there. Over the next couple of days, his big contact becomes a man named George Butler, who was a lieutenant or captain, as he describes it, in the Dallas Homicide Division. On the day that Oswald was shot, 2 days later, the 24th, Butler came to the Commerce Street end of the ramp and called out to the reporters, "Come in." Waldo said he and the other reporters entered the ramp, at which time a uniformed officer checked their credentials. He said that Butler was an extremely nervous man, so nervous that when I was standing, asking him a question after I'd entered the ramp and gotten down to the basement area, and Butler is the head of security at this point, according to Waldo, just moments before Oswald was brought down, he was standing profile to me, and I noticed his lips trembling as he listened and waited for my answer. Waldo said that when the Dallas detectives escorted Oswald out of the hallway and into the ramp, it was necessary for them to walk within a few feet of the rear end of the parked police car where Waldo was standing with the ABC man. Waldo said as they passed, the ABC man pushed the microphone out in front of Oswald's face and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" A man in a hat made one long lunging step from Waldo's right to the front of Oswald, shoved out his hand, and shot Oswald. Now, so Butler, in my mind, is one of the key suspects of this entire plot involving JFK, Oswald, Tippit, you name it. After a week after the assassination, this man I mentioned, the Army officer in El Paso, John Sutton, who is now living in Fort Worth, he asked Waldo if they could meet at the Dallas Press Club. When they met, Sutton told him he had an informant that had seen Ruby and Tippit and Bernard Weissman together at the Carousel Club. Remember this story? This is not the same story, by the way, as the Jarnigan story. This is another story. And he was reluctant to come forward because he had an affair with a stripper, the informant did, and feared he would lose his work and his family if it got out. Now, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Commission Document 1, the FBI report that came out in early December, that report said that Oswald, a loner all his life, acted by himself. So it got leaked to the press. And the question got out pretty quickly, why was the FBI probe leaked to the press? Very, very good question. People were asking that at that time. The FBI, et cetera, looked pretty sweet with this kind of thing going on. Meanwhile, Sutton and Waldo get together, and Sutton introduces him to his informant. He tells him his informant is Phil Burns, white male, late 30s, 5'8", 145 pounds, chestnut hair, glasses, employed at an advertising agency on account of one of Sutton's sponsors. Sutton told Waldo a little bit later that he called the advertising agency and learned Phil Burns' actual name. His actual name was Paul Bridewell. Burns said to Waldo that Ruby introduced him to J.D. Tippit and Bernard Weissman. They shook hands. Burns walked away, heard nothing. Now, if you want to know my opinion about this whole story about Paul Bridewell, Phil Burns, whether it was made up by Sutton or made up by somebody else, I don't think Waldo made it. But I'll tell you this much. I think the whole story about Ruby introducing him to Tippit and Weissman was made up by Burns. It was to get Waldo engaged in red herring type stories. Waldo said that he was too scared to publish the story and other information that he had about the assassination. He'd been working with Mark Lane at this point. Mark Lane introduces Waldo to Dorothy Kilgallen. Her article about the Tippit, Ruby, and Weissman meeting appeared on the front page of the Journal American. And this is on like December 8th, 2 weeks or so, I think, after the assassination. Around that same time, Marguerite Oswald's in the paper. She's going, I know my son. And she thinks, as we know, that her son is an agent for American intelligence. And so this whole article, December 8th, just attacks Marguerite Oswald up and down the street and the Journal American picks it up from the AP. The Journal American loves dirt on a variety of subjects. They are really a dangerous outlet in terms of foisting crazy stories. And you see that they're at the top of the list of press that Hoover watches very carefully. He's got a little stamp. The stamp has the Washington Post, the Daily News, Evening Star, the Washington papers. Then you got the Herald Trib, Journal American, Mirror, Daily News, Post, New York Times. Then you got the communist press, the Worker, the New Leader. Then you got the capitalist press, the Wall Street Journal. You got the popular press, the National Observer, which is nowhere anymore, and back to the communist press, the People's World. Those are the 12 people he thought were most important, 12 papers, most important on the JFK case. Can you imagine? It shows you what his agenda is. Meanwhile, more nonsense is getting into the press, courtesy of Lenny Hudkins. Hudkins advises on December 17th, he's just returned from a weekend in Dallas, where he's talked to Alan Sweat from the criminal division. He's the chief sheriff's office. It's his opinion Oswald's being paid $200 by the FBI as an informant in connection with their subversive investigations. He furnished the alleged informant as S-172. I mean, this is a kind of informant that Jim Hosty worked with all the time. They got paid $200, da-da-da. Now, here's another letter from Hoover to the Warren Commission Rankin. Now, who's doing this, spreading this story? Joe Golden, who's writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He uses 179. Golden is the guy, by the way, who is handles the documents of the estate of David Atlee Phillips. Golden is not the guy who I consider a truth teller. And the other people who worked with Hudkins to spread this story was Bill Alexander and Hugh Ainsworth, who said they made it up to try to prove that their phones were being tapped by the FBI. I don't believe these gentlemen for a single moment about anything, for a variety of reasons, most of which I think you already know. Now, here's the National Guardian, which is the left-wing newspaper in the United States, Progressive News Weekly. And their headline is, "A grave doubt plagues the United States, and is Oswald innocent? A lawyer's brief," and they run Mark Lane's brief attacking the evidence, where some of this evidence is now getting squirreled right inside Mark Lane's stuff, which I think actually wound up hurting Mark Lane's credibility. He's got a lot of good stuff, and the bad stuff, I think, is this kind of nonsense. Now, shortly after, Rankin writes Marguerite a letter saying, "I would like to acknowledge receipt of your telegram requesting your attorney be permitted to cross-examine any witnesses whose testimony is taken by this commission, in particular the testimony of Marina Oswald. And I enclose a copy of your letter to your attorney, Mark Lane. Mark Lane and Marguerite want him to have the right to cross-examine these witnesses. And here is one of the great, great events of dirt. And it comes right from Marguerite's testimony to the Warren Commission. She's going to fly out in early February of 64 to testify, her and Marina. And so she told Mr. Mark Lane, I'm not going in the car with Mr. Mike Howard. He's the Secret Service guy. And there was another Mr. Howard, by the way, who came that day, and that was Pat, Mike's brother. I don't know whether he was his brother or not. We'll have to find out, sir. That day I was going to leave for Washington. I said, Lane, I'm scared to death. He says, don't worry. I will call Mr. Walden. That's Mr. Waldo, who is the Star Telegram reporter, and ask him to accompany you. And Mark Lane called Mr. Walden of the Star Telegram and asked him to accompany me, and Mr. Walden did accompany me with these two Secret Service men to the airport. And when Mr. Walden entered my home, I told him, I'm so glad you were here because I didn't want to go with this agent by myself. And I've got a photo here, courtesy of none other than Dale Myers, where he superimposes Waldo's picture with the headline on the Star Telegram: Witness to assassination, waits to name Oswald. Negro to give details. Who was that witness? Who was that Negro? Well, here's Mark Lane quoting from what Mike Howard said to him after he dropped off Marguerite. Mike says to Mark Lane, wait till that old black boy gets up in front of the Warren Commission and tells his story. That will settle everything. Yes, sir. He was right there on the same floor looking out that next window. And after that first shot, he looked and saw Oswald, and then he ran. I saw him in the Dallas police station. He was still the scaredest cat I ever saw him. I heard him tell the officer, man, you don't know how fast is because you didn't see me run that day. He said he ran and hid behind the boxes because he was afraid Oswald would shoot him. Mike Howard then explained that the Negro witness had been arrested by the Special Services Office of the Dallas Police for gambling. And since he was familiar with that branch of the Dallas Police, he immediately gave himself up to that branch. Mr. Howard alleged that he had visited the Negro witness while he was in custody of the Special Services in the Dallas jail. And then what happened was Thayer Waldo ran that article the next day, not with those exact words, but saying that there was a witness who was in protective custody by the by the Dallas police. And it was a 6-column piece, and it made a lot of headlines, as you can imagine, and lots of letters and this and that. And then Thayer Waldo wound up writing the declaration after Lane tipped off the paper that, and others, I might add, as to Waldo's identity, and that Mike Howard was his informant. Mike Howard really pulled a fast one up on Waldo, is what had happened. Waldo writes a declaration. Well, the way he told it was, well, when that old black boy, this is coming again from Mike Howard. Well, then when that old black boy gets before the Warren Commission and tells what he knows, that will stop them all talking. Pat Howard turned half around in his seat and gave me an elaborate wink with raised eyebrows, as if to say, so here's what I was telling you about. He looked and saw Oswald kneeling at the next window with a rifle aimed at the street. Mike Howard said the Negro later told the Dallas police officers to whom he surrendered, I was scared to death. I thought he would kill me too. I just turned and ran way over to the far side of the room and squeezed me down behind some empty crates. So yeah, Mark Lane pretty well accurately got what Thayer was told by Mike Howard. And Waldo wrapped up his statement to his editor saying, under penalty of perjury, they slapped a vagrancy charge on him so they could hold him, Mike said. He was still just about the scaredest Negro I ever saw, nothing but whites to his eyes. About as racist as you can get. They have now transferred him somewhere else, I understand. I don't know where. So here's the letter Mike Howard wrote, and we just dug this out of the archives a couple weeks ago. Thank you very much, Chad Nagel, for the hard work. What Mike told Forrest Sorrells back in February 64 was he was supposed to have heard the shots just above him and had hidden for fear that he might have been shot also. When the Negro found out someone had shot the president for fear of getting involved, he allegedly had a record of vagrancy or some other minor violation with the Dallas Police Department. My brother and I were laughing about it, not paying any attention to our passenger, till he leaned from the back seat and said, "Is this Negro going to testify before the Warren Commission?" I laughed. I said I didn't know that. I had never talked to the man and wasn't even assigned to the assassination investigation. My brother said, I said, I don't know the name of the Negro or where he was now. My brother said they're probably holding him in protective custody on a vagrancy charge. We all laughed. And then Mike goes, I did not know Waldo was a reporter at the time he was riding in my car. I knew him only as a friend of Mark Lane, the lawyer of Oswald and his mother, Marguerite. But Pat Howard testified about, many months later to the FBI. Pat admitted Mrs. Oswald identified this individual who was to accompany them as Thayer Waldo, a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Period. So the Howards couldn't even get their own story straight. But they didn't think they were going to get in trouble. And you can bet they did not get in trouble. The Waldo report to the FBI after this happened, after the article ran a couple days later, Waldo told the FBI that after the story was originally written, the source, Mike Howard, called him on the phone, and the only change in the story was the fact that the witness was not on the 6th floor, but on the 5th floor. He had to massage that little bit, and that was the part he massaged and told Forrest Sorrells. And then he changed it, and then he told Thayer that he got that little part wrong. A pretty important part to get wrong, I might add. Jack Revel, Special Services Bureau, Dallas Police, advised he knows of no witness was being held in protective custody. He stated that in his opinion, with respect to the story in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the witness referred to may possibly be Charles Douglas Gibbons. Now, who's Charles Douglas Gibbons? I'll tell you who Charles Douglas Gibbons is. He was in the 5th floor during the morning filling orders with Lee Oswald on November 22nd. Lee was standing by the elevator in the building at 11:30 when Gibbons went to the 1st floor. When he started down in the elevator, Lee yelled at him to close the gates in the elevator so Lee could have the elevator return to the 6th floor. On the morning of November 22nd, Gibbons observed Lee reading a newspaper in the Domino Room, where the employees eat lunch about 11:50 a.m. So here we are, 11:50 a.m., Gibbons sees Lee eating lunch, reading the paper. Now, Gibbons was only one of 4 witnesses who stated they saw Oswald on the 1st floor during lunchtime. William Shelley, supervisor of the floor laying crew, said, I do remember seeing him when I came down to eat lunch about 10 to 12, as did the building's janitor, Eddie Piper, who said he saw Oswald just at 12 o'clock. Carolyn Arnold saw him about 12:20. Pat Spear points out that Gibbons began to change his story within days of Howard's talking to Waldo. The February 21st, 64 cover story of Life magazine, which treated Oswald's sole guilt as a proven fact, revealed a few minutes after noon, as the president and his wife were pulling away from the airport in the open presidential limousine, an employee in the school book building, Charles Gibbons, saw Oswald on the 6th floor and said, let's go down and watch the president go by. Not now, Oswald responded. Just send the elevator back up. So what that means is that now, instead of seeing Oswald in the lunchroom at 11:50, they're saying, oh, right after noontime, Mr. Gibbons saw Oswald up on the 6th floor and staying on the 6th floor. That's pretty serious. So here is the exchange between Marguerite and Earl Warren. I want people to understand just how strong Marguerite was during this period of time before we finish the Gibbons story. It's not an accusation about your son. It's an accusation about your son in Texas courts. That's an entirely different proceeding. We're here to do justice and be fair to everyone. And it's our main and only purpose in serving on this commission. None of us cherish this responsibility. I'm sure, sir. And the only satisfaction we can derive is to be fair to all concerned. And I assure you that's our objective. Mrs. Oswald again. I do not imply this commission will not be fair. I know about the men on the commission. They're all fine men, including yourself, Chief Justice Warren. But I do state a fact that I do not think that you can come to a true conclusion. I want that for record. And she says, I implore you in the name of justice to let my son, Lee Harvey Oswald, who's accused of assassinating the president, and I, the mother of this man who's the accused mothers, be represented by counsel. Chairman, before you leave, Mrs. Oswald, may I say to you first, the commission's not here to prosecute your dead son. It is not here, and it was not established to prosecute anyone. And Marguerite says, I'm not in agreement with you. One thing I want to make clear. We do not know the questions you're asking of myself or Marina or the other witnesses, and I contend that you cannot ask them the pertinent questions because you don't know what I know and what Mr. Lane knows. And so you will have an analysis in the long run, a conclusion. And then Rankin says to Mrs. Oswald, he was being prepared to become an agent and inspired by his recruiting officer? Yes, sir. By what you have told us about reading the communist literature in this one pamphlet and also the manual of the Marine Corps? Yes, sir. And then living to when he's age 17 to join the Marines, which I knew, and which he did at age 17 on his birthday. Now, Rankin. Now, what else do you base your idea that he was ever an agent or to become an agent on? Mrs. Oswald. Many, many things. We always watched I Led Three Lives, the program about Filbert. We always watched that. And when Lee returned from the Marines and the service, the 3 days he was there with me, the program was on and he turned it off. He said, Mother, don't watch that. That is a lot of propaganda. You've heard Robert say he watched it, but that's Mrs. Oswald. And she also tells us that after he came back from the Marines, he said it's propaganda, which, of course, was true. Mark Lane talks about the Warren Commission's refusal to appoint him. He said, the dead and absent were tried in the courts of Nuremberg. As a last resort to prevent embarrassment, they appointed the president of a bar association to conduct the defense of Oswald. And then they forgot all about him. And Lane added, it is the first time in history that counsel has been appointed, forgetting about the counsel retained by the family. The guy did nothing. He sat there like a mannequin. In April, Givens changes his story to the FBI. No longer Oswald's alibi witness, Givens was now the Warren Commission star witness. He alone, among all the witnesses, is supposed to have seen Oswald on the 6th floor of the book depository by 11:55 and never saw him downstairs between 11:30 to 12:30. And this comes from Don Thomas's essay, Rewriting History. Hence, Givens gave 2 accounts of Oswald's whereabouts. One in November that tended to corroborate Oswald's alibi, and a second in April that tended to incriminate him. Yet his statement in November contained no mention of Oswald on the 6th floor, while the statement in April contains a denial that he'd seen Oswald elsewhere. So that's the Givens wrap-up. And that's the way the Givens story has been told for the last 60 years, as not an alibi, but rather the great accuser. Now, Waldo, about a month later, in May, he gave a deposition to the Warren Commission. And he told the FBI later on that he didn't get into all these events. And the reason why was because he was enjoined before beginning his formal declaration, please confine yourself exclusively to the events of November 24th, 1963. Now, as damning as it was about George Butler, they could, you don't read anything else about George Butler anywhere. And Waldo's statements about all these other events, which were incredibly important, were not allowed to be part of the testimony. Now, what did Waldo do? He offered Warren Commissioner an interview person, Leon Hubert, a manuscript he wrote with reporter Ed Johnson called The Dallas Murders. He offered it to him on the record. Hubert didn't want it. So who did he work with instead? Dorothy Kilgallen. That's who he gave his story to, as I mentioned. And that was published, I had the date wrong. It was actually not published until September the 3rd, 1964. Who else was he working with? He was working with people like Jim Cody and Bill Hunter. and Ed Johnson. Cody was one focused hardest on the book publicly. Waldo did not want to be publicly associated. He was scared for his life, scared for his family. Cody's associates were Waldo, Johnson, and Bill Hunter. Cody, Waldo, and Johnson covered the presidential visit for their papers, and all three of them covered the assassination and the Ruby trial. Cody's task for the book was an in-depth study of the leaders in Dallas. Cody was killed supposedly with a karate chop when coming out of his shower later in September 64, days after Kilgallen's article, and then falsely accused of being gay. Bill Hunter, who had been assisting on the book, had been killed 5 months earlier, shot while sitting down in a police station by a Long Beach officer who first said he had dropped his revolver and then changed his story and said he was playing quick draw, like Quick Draw McGraw, with his partner when the gun went off. Within a week, I've done work on around grand jury proceedings and arrest, and this is unbelievable what I'm going to tell you here. Within a week, a 22-year-old ex-con from Alabama named Larry Earl Reno was picked up selling Cody's personal effects and held on suspicion of murder. As opposed to his personal effects, he had in his house the notes of his book. They were never found, just like Dorothy Kilgallen a year later. When the Reno case came before the grand jury, District Attorney Henry Wade secretly instructed the jurors not to indict, an extraordinary move for a chief prosecuting officer with as strong a case as he had. So he put on a whole case, and then he told the jurors not to indict. Can you imagine? And the jurors went along with Wade. And then, Dorothy Kilgallen went on to write a column a month later saying, maybe you didn't know. And she was furious about the whole situation involving the Warren Commission report, which had just come out days earlier, days after the Cody killing. At any rate, the whole thing smells a bit fishy. It's a mite too simple that a chap kills the president of the United States, escapes from that bother, kills a policeman, eventually is apprehended in a movie theater under circumstances that defy every law of police procedure, and subsequently is murdered under extraordinary circumstances. Now, as a result of this terrible drama with the article that blew up in his face in May of 64, Waldo was asked basically to depart from his newspaper. And then he was asked to depart, as we'll see, from Mexico himself in 1967. How did this series of events occur? Bill Turner was quoted in the Mexico City paper in 67 telling this story. Waldo explained his resignation from the University of the Americas in Mexico City as resulting from pressures applied to university officials by powerful American business interests following his talk at the Foreign Correspondents Club debunking the Warren Report. Waldo went on vacation in Los Angeles. In July, Turner said he wired his resignation and then followed up with a letter to the head of the university. So he wound up writing for the local paper in Illinois called the Alton Evening Telegraph, a real step down. From then, Waldo had a pretty tough life. He wound up living in Mexico in the 1980s. I found a good article about reuniting the child he gave up for adoption 2 years before he died. He died in 1989 under mysterious circumstances in the embassy in Mexico City. And the question has to be asked, was he one of ours or was he one of theirs? And by ours, I mean the research community as opposed to theirs, meaning the people who were involved in the cover-up of this assassination, if not worse. And I'm confident in walking through this material that Thayer Waldo was one of ours, and the other side spent its time packing the record or attempting to pack the record through him. And the last thing I want to say is that Bridewell story, the informant, the fellow who Waldo wound up telling the story to, he was already out of the business, and he was a guy in Hollywood. He said maybe you can do something with it. And the guy he gave the Bridewell story to was no one else other than Larry Schiller, who wrote all those bogus books with poor Norman Mailer, who was forced to do it because he hadn't paid his taxes, needed to curry favor with the powers that be. So he wrote Oswald's Tale and all those other books. I love Norman Mailer. I'm not a fan of Larry Schiller for obvious reasons. And Larry worked with the FBI trying to find this guy, and they had nothing but bogus leads, like him living in Oregon and this and that. But I found a guy who I think really was Bridwell, and which led me to believe that Sutton was probably on the level and Waldo was probably on the level. Because I found a guy named Paul Bridwell who had Texas connections and Texas lineage, although he didn't grow up there. He'd spent time there. And in fact, he left the service in July of 1963 and probably found himself at that advertising agency in Dallas. The guy's name, Paul Bridwell, well, he was there at Guadalcanal, and he was out there in Saipan. And years later, this commanding officer had the duty of protecting the CIA headquarters out there in Saipan. And so when they were out there looking for, of all people, you're not going to believe this, Amelia Earhart, he gave them some good leads, and at the same time, he made their job very difficult. He was security oriented. I don't think Bridwell was involved in, killing JFK. And I don't think he probably wasn't even wittingly involved in the cover. He may have been unwittingly. He may have been wittingly. His job was security. He was a security guy. He made sure people were not able to get to the far side of the island where the CIA facility was. He did give our local reporter a couple of helpful leads on the Earhart story, I believe. I don't think they were phony. So there it is. It's wheels within wheels. I think Waldo was one of ours. Thank you.